Okay, I'm Maurice Samuels, professor of French and the director of the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. And along with my co-organizer, Samuel Moyne from the Department of History and the Law School, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Yale and to this conference on anti-Semitism and the crisis of liberalism. Why did the French revolutionaries take the trouble to grant Jews civil rights? At a time of famine, war, and unprecedented civil unrest, the revolutionaries certainly had more pressing concerns than the fate of a group who represented less than 0.2% of the French population. But if Jews were not statistically significant, they were symbolically significant. By emancipating the Jews, Europe's paradigmatic ethnic and religious minority, the French revolutionaries boldly defined the new liberal order they were calling into being, one that guaranteed liberty, equality, and fraternity, in theory at least, to all men. Their action is a starting point for this conference. In the 2.5 centuries that followed the French and American revolutions, as Jews moved from the margins to the mainstream, their fate became tightly bound up with the fate of liberal democracy, not just as its most visible beneficiaries, but also as some of its leading actors, proponents, and theorists. Indeed, so close was the affiliation between Jews and liberalism that opposition to the liberal democratic order during the Dreyfus Affair in Weimar Germany and other moments of crisis often took the form of anti-Semitism. Jews became lightning rods for a range of discontents with the world the revolutionaries had conjured into being, its institutions and its values. In our own moment of crisis, we see the opposite taking place, with a war on liberal institutions, including the university, being carried out in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. The reversal is head-spinning. Zionism has, of course, complicated the association of Jews and liberalism, forcing Israelis and their supporters to contend with what it means to be a majority population struggling to balance Palestinian rights with their own desire for national self-determination. How to think about all of this? How to understand the current crisis of liberalism and its relation to anti-Semitism, both historically and in relation to other current trends and events? What does this crisis mean for Jews, and what does it mean for everyone else, including members of other minority groups? To try to answer these questions, we brought together at this conference some of the world's leading historians, political scientists, legal scholars, and journalists. We're grateful to them for making the trip and for sharing their insights with us. And before I call up the first panel, let me just say a few more words of thanks to everyone who made this conference possible. So first, my gratitude to Sam Moyne, who's been a partner in every aspect of planning this conference. I also want to thank Linda Maisels, the new managing director of Yale's anti-Semitism program. We are so lucky to have her working beside Inessa Laskova, whose logistical savvy has kept the program running since the beginning. Orly Ogilvie is our student helper. Rick Rollins deserves the credit for the beautiful poster. Kachitan Iheka, Diane Brown, and the staff of the Whitney Humanities Center, including Amy Neal, have provided extensive support for this conference and for the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism more generally, as have Yale's president, Mari McGinnis, and deans Stephen Wilkinson and Mark Robinson, who is here with us today. I'll be honest, it has not always been easy to run a program for the study of anti-Semitism, especially in such a perilous time. But I'm fortunate to have colleagues across the university, as well as students who have been so thoughtful as our current crisis of liberalism continues to unfold. This conference is made possible by generous grants from the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kempf Memorial Fund at the Betty McMillan Center for International Studies at Yale, the Jason M. Folk Memorial Fund at the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and with support from partners across the university, including the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, the Jewish Studies Program, the Department of French, and the Whitney Humanities Center. Before we get started, let me just say a few words about how things will work. We have a first panel this afternoon and then a full day of panels tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. Everything will take place here in HQLO2, but we're also live streaming the conference, and I think we have hundreds of people registered online, which is great. Those watching remotely can ask questions using the Q&A function, and we will do our best to relay those questions to the panelists. I know that many of the issues that we'll be discussing are contentious ones, and I just want to remind everyone that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with the speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy and will not be allowed. We encourage the audience to ask questions of our panelists, but we request that they be concise and that they be actual questions. Also, we will be recording, but no other recording is allowed. Now I'll ask the first panel to please take the stage, and I will hand things over to our chair, my colleague Isaac Nakhimovsky from the Yale History Department. So thank you all.
Hello, everyone. My name is Isaac Nakhimovsky. I teach in the History Department in the Humanities program here at Yale. And it's my pleasure to introduce this distinguished panel of historians, or panel of distinguished historians, rather. So we have, well, both, let's say. So we have 5 historians. So I will, in order to keep us in time, I will go ahead and introduce all of them at once, after which each of them will speak for 15 minutes. And after that, we'll have some time for concise, actual questions. So our first speaker will be David A. Bell. He is the Sidney and Ruth Lepidus Professor in the History Department at Princeton University. He is a specialist in the history of Enlightenment and Revolutionary France, and the author of 7 books, including most recently Men on Horseback, The Power of Charisma in the Age of Revolution. Our second speaker is Antoine Lilti, professor of history at the Collège de France. He is a historian of the French and European Enlightenment with a specific interest in their intellectual legacy. He's published The World of the Salons from Oxford in 2015, The Invention of Celebrity, Polity 2017, and The Legacy of the Enlightenment, Ambivalences of Modernity, which I believe is coming out in English translation later this year. It was published in French in 2019. Our next speaker will be Helena Rosenblatt. She is Distinguished Professor of History, Political Science, and French at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her publications include Rousseau in Geneva, From the First Discourse to the Social Contract, 1749 to 1762, from Cambridge University Press, Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant and the Politics of Religion, also Cambridge, and The Lost History of Liberalism, From Ancient Rome to the 21st Century, from Princeton. And she's presently working on an intellectual biography of Madame de Staël, for which she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Paul Hanebrink is professor of history and Jewish studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, where he has taught since 2001. He is the author of 2 books, In Defense of Christian Hungary, Religion, Nationalism, Antisemitism, 1890 to 1944, from 2006, and A Spectre Haunting Europe, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, from 2018. And A Spectre Haunting Europe has also appeared in Italian and Romanian translation. And finally, David Sorkin is a Lucy G. Moses Professor of Modern Jewish History here at Yale. His most recent book is Jewish Emancipation, A History Across 5 Centuries, from Princeton. And he is currently completing a book entitled The Invention of Modern Jewish Politics, 1790 to 1914, which will be published by Yale University Press. So without further ado, let me turn things over to David Bell.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm very grateful to Maury and to Sam for the invitation and to the Center for sponsoring this. So what I want to talk about in this paper is the way that philo-Semitism can stumble on the issue of Jewish difference. which is to say how philo-Semitism can all too easily generate its opposite. And I'll talk about it specifically in the context of the French Revolution and the French Enlightenment, with some very brief case studies. And I'll finish with some thoughts on their implications for the longer history of liberalism and the Jews. So the first case is that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. When the topic of the French Enlightenment and the Jews arises, Rousseau is not always the writer who receives the most attention. Not surprisingly, Voltaire gets more, given the many critical and very offensive things that he wrote about Jews. And we'll hear much more about Voltaire in a moment from Antoine Lilti. But Rousseau wrote a great deal about nations and nation states. And this is what makes this discussion of the Jews so important. So one of the most significant of his writings on the Jews appeared in his book, The Considerations on the Government of Poland. He wrote the book at the request of Polish nobles in the 1770s as they were trying to devise a new constitution for the Commonwealth. And in the book, he offered one of his strongest defenses of what we would call now national pride and national identity. To quote him, "It is institutions which shape the genius, the character, the tastes, and the customs of a people, that make them themselves and none other." At the same time, Rousseau lamented that strong national identities were fading out in Europe. To quote him further, "Today there are no longer any Frenchmen, Germans, Spaniards, or even Englishmen, whatever one might say. They're only Europeans. They all have the same tastes, the same passions, the same customs, because none of them have been molded into a national shape by a particular institution." And for Rousseau, this was definitely not a good thing. In contrast, he cited the example of three peoples who had received a proper national shape thanks to the work of almost superhuman legislators. Two of these men came from European antiquity, Lycurgus of Sparta and Numa of Rome. The third was Moses. And I'm quoting him again. "Moses dared turn a wandering and servile tribe into a political body and a free people. And while they wandered in the wilderness without even rocks to lay their heads on, he gave them that lasting form which 5,000 years have not managed to destroy or even modify, and which survives to this very day with all its strength, even though the physical nation itself no longer exists." So in other words, Rousseau presented Moses and the Jews as a model of nationhood. Indeed, as the most successful in history, you might say, since the Jews had survived even in exile while Sparta and Rome had perished. Now, this text of Rousseau, I think, was all the more important because it drew on and resonated with two older and powerful European views of Jews as model nation builders. One of these was the common tendency among European peoples to describe themselves as a new Israel, and therefore as a people chosen by God. So you can find such rhetoric very commonly in European political discourse from the late Middle Ages on. It had particularly powerful resonance among Protestants, thanks to their devotion to the Old Testament and their sense of them, their desire to present themselves as an elect. So the Dutch, the Boers of South Africa, the Swedes, the English, the Puritans, and Pilgrims of Massachusetts all repeatedly invoked the image of a new Israel, not only to imply their own election by God, but to associate themselves with the same power and durability that Rousseau had found in the biblical people of Israel and in Moses. In addition, it's worth remembering that one of the most common political metaphors used in early modern Europe implicitly invoked an image of biblical Israel as well, which is the metaphor of slavery. Now, given our own consciousness of the horrors of early modern chattel slavery in the Americas, we find it hard to read Europeans and Americans of the time calling themselves slaves without feeling a certain revulsion at their hypocrisy. We even wonder if the metaphor concealed a kind of certain repressed guilt. But as Michael Walzer observed many years ago in his book Exodus and Revolution, the most common referent for images of slavery, especially for the collective slavery of an entire people, was that of the Jews in Egypt. And when Europeans spoke of an entire people freeing themselves from slavery, they mostly did not have Africans in mind, even if they should have done, but rather Hebrew slaves in Egypt who had succeeded in liberating themselves and in forging themselves into a durable national body. So in short, Rousseau both built on and offered theoretical reinforcement to these older foundations, which is one major reason why his text was so important. So you might think, great, okay, good. The Jews offered a positive model. But at the same time, for exactly the same reasons, they presented a problem. Because what happens when a people like the Jews, with a powerfully distinct way of being, find themselves in the midst of another people? Here's how Rousseau continued his discussion. So I'll quote him again. To prevent his people from dissolving amidst foreign peoples, Moses gave them customs and values incompatible with those of other nations. He gave them a surfeit of special rites and ceremonies. He put 1,000 restrictions on them to bind them and keep them always alien to other men. And all the bonds of fraternity that he created between members of his own republic became barriers that have separated them from their neighbors, despite all the hate and persecution visited upon them by the rest of the human race. Now, Rousseau did not elaborate on the potential difficulties that this Jewish difference might pose to the Gentile societies in which they lived, but one of his most influential followers did. This was Henri Grégoire, a parish priest from Lorraine who came to prominence in 1788 by winning an essay contest on the question of how to make the Jews more useful to France. He published his entry under the title Essay on the Physical, Moral, and Political Regeneration of the Jews. Unlike Rousseau, Grégoire did not attribute Jewish difference solely to Moses, but also to a subsequent and lengthy process of what he called degeneration. This process, he argued, had corrupted the Jews, both physically and morally. It had made them clannish, suspicious, avaricious, inbred, physically weak, and even smelly. Grégoire blamed this degeneration squarely on Gentile persecution. It's not the Jews' fault. But it was, in his view, no less a problem for all that. The mere presence of the Jews on French soil, in his view, damaged national unity, disturbed public order, and threatened economic progress. Grégoire's solution to this problem was simple: give the Jews full civil rights, allow them to choose their own professions, expose them to all the benefits of advanced French civilization. And he himself would go on as a deputy to the Revolutionary Constituent Assembly in 1790-91 to help sponsor the legislation which Maury referred to just a moment ago, and which did actually grant full civil rights to French Jews. So you can see why so many French Jews have ever after hailed Grégoire as the key architect of their emancipation, and why his remains were transferred to the pantheon of great French national figures in 1989, despite his views of Jews as, quote, degenerate. But the solution didn't really stop with the granting of full civil rights. For Grégoire, justice alone was not sufficient reason for Jewish emancipation. What would their regeneration accomplish? Here's how he answered the question. To quote, "By encouraging the Jews in this way, they will imperceptibly adopt our ways of thinking and acting, our laws, our customs and practices. Once they are both physically and morally regenerated, they will acquire a healthier and more robust temperament, as well as new enlightenment and honesty." In other words, the ultimate solution to the problem posed by Jewish difference was simple: erase it. Grégoire was, I think, the first political figure in modern history to employ the image of melting, what we would now call in America the melting pot, as a metaphor for assimilation. He wrote, and I quote, "of melting the Jews, so to speak, into the national mass." Ultimately, as a member of the Catholic clergy, his goal, as he stated at several points in his career, was to encourage Jews to convert to Christianity. There was one other double-edged aspect of Jewish difference which Rousseau hinted at, and which Grégoire spoke more explicitly of, and this was Jewish power. In Grégoire's essay, there are insistent, repeated invocations of what the Jews can do for France. Once the Jews regenerated and embraced virtue and hard work, a revolution would take place that would generate, and I'm quoting him, "a surplus of industry and wealth." A fairly extraordinary statement given, as you just heard Maury say, that the Jews constituted less than 1/5 of 1% of the French population. Now, Grégoire was searching for every possible argument to bolster his case. Still, at several points in the essay, there are distinct indications that Grégoire thought the Jews could produce significant beneficial effects far out of proportion to their numbers in the French population. And here, too, it's very easy to see how an argument originally formulated in favor of the Jews could be turned against them, because Jewish power could be admired, but of course it could also be feared. And all these arguments about Jewish difference took on political salience in the early years of the French Revolution, when the Constituent Assembly did take up the question of whether to accord the Jews civil rights. And a particularly important moment was the debate that took place on December 24th, 1789. And one speech from this debate is very well known. It was delivered by the Count of Clermont-Tonnerre, an advocate of Jewish emancipation. He asked whether it was possible to give the Jews equal rights when they had their own laws and law courts, and he responded as follows, and I quote, "We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation and grant them everything as individuals. They must not be allowed to constitute either a political body or an order within the state, and if they refuse, then they must be expelled. It would be repugnant to have a nation within the nation." These lines are still quoted today as a founding document of French secularism and of principled opposition to so-called communitarianism in France. And you can see, obviously, the link to Rousseau. But it's important to remember also the response to Clermont-Tonnerre by the conservative clerical deputy Jean-Cyprien Maury. He replied by first citing Voltaire, of all people, about the Jews, and particularly their avarice. And then he continued as follows, and it sounds a little like Rousseau here. Quote, "The Jews have gone for 17 centuries without mixing with other nations. They've never done any work except practicing usury. They've been the scourge of agricultural regions. In Poland, the sweat of Christian slaves waters the furrows which feed the opulence of the Jews." And Maury then claimed that thanks to the mortgages the Jews had given to Christians in Alsace, if they gained the right to own land themselves, then I quote, "In 10 years they will have conquered the whole province and turned it into a Jewish colony." In other words, Maury agreed with Grégoire that Jewish difference had strongly negative social consequences, but he agreed with Rousseau that the difference might be all too deep-seated to be eradicated simply by giving the Jews a new civil status. And at the same time, throughout the revolutionary debates on Jewish civil status, the disproportionate power of the Jews was repeatedly raised as yet another possibly threatening element of their difference. Strikingly, of 24 pamphlets published by Gentiles in this period in favor of Jewish rights, 3/4 actually stressed the idea that if the Jews were emancipated, they would make France rich. The Comte de Mirabeau, the leading figure in the Constituent Assembly, said this in 1790. "The Jews have the eminent prudence, activity, and flexibility necessary to accommodate all situations. We know their talent for trade. They've shown themselves highly skilled in the mechanical arts, wherever they've been permitted to exercise them." But on the other hand, the very anti-Semitic Prince de Broglie, a firm opponent of granting the Jews emancipation, presented the same power of the Jews as a threat. He spoke of, quote, "powerful Jews conspiring to take over the province of Alsace," and particularly noted the increase in the Jewish population there, which he claimed had nearly doubled in just 15 years. To quote, "The province of Alsace is being threatened with being, so to speak, invaded by this Jewish colony." Again, Jewish colonization, a phrase with a long future ahead of it. So just a couple of words of conclusion. The French Enlightenment was not, for the most part, pluralistic. Very few of its major figures were comfortable with the idea that different interests and different value systems could coexist within a single political body. Freedom of speech was fine, but it wasn't pluralism. Yes, there was wide agreement that people should be free to debate, but once the debate had concluded, a political sovereign, whether an individual or perhaps a collective, would have to make a decision, and then it would be up to everybody else in the state to obey that decision. In this world, there really was very little room for Jewish difference. Either it was something that was essentially vile and needed to be eradicated, possibly for the sake of the Jews themselves, as with Grégoire, or it was something that might be admirable in the abstract, even serve as a model of nationhood, but that was deeply threatening when it existed within another nation, within France. To my mind, the great achievement of modern liberalism with respect to the Jews is not only the defense of religious toleration and the general principle of civil equality, but also the acceptance of pluralism, what the French might call the apprenticeship of pluralism, acquired as much through hard experience as through theorizing. The acceptance of a form of equality that can tolerate important degrees of difference within a single state. So in that sense, the French Enlightenment posed the problem, but the solution would only come much later. Thank you very much.
So first I want to thank Maurice and Sam for having invited me to participate to this important conference. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation. I have chosen to focus on the case of Voltaire because I believe it offers a unique window onto the ambiguities that color the relationship between liberalism and anti-Semitism. I would like to begin with two contrasting narratives that shape our contemporary image of Voltaire. On the one hand, the author of Candide stands as the very embodiment of the Enlightenment, championing the fight for religious tolerance, as well as intellectual and political freedom. The transfer of his remains into the Pantheon in 1791 coincided precisely with the decree emancipating the Jews. Later, the fledgling Third Republic organized public commemorations for the centenary of his death. And in France, until today, as you know, Voltaire has been widely seen as the personification of a liberal and tolerant Enlightenment and a major figure of the Republican spirit. Yet, a very different narrative has gained traction in recent years, one that calls out Voltaire anti-Judaism, to the extent of casting him as one of the founding fathers of modern anti-Semitism, which ultimately paved the way for the Shoah. A striking example can be found in an article in Foreign Policy where journalist Nabila Ramdani goes so far as to draw a parallel between Voltaire and Hitler. A slightly less sensational version appears in the writings of the French academic and public intellectual Pierre-André Taguieff. For instance, in a recent article tellingly entitled "The Hatred of Jews in the Age of Enlightenment," the case of Voltaire, Taguieff cast a wider net, implicating the Enlightenment as the wellspring of contemporary anti-Semitism, different from Christian anti-Judaism, but no less dangerous. He has developed at length this line of argument in a book, La Judéophobie des modernes, des Lumières au djihad mondial. How are we to make sense of this paradox? How can the very figurehead of the French Enlightenment also be cast as one of the driving forces behind modern anti-Semitism, the kind espoused by Nazis or Islamist terrorists? There are several ways to approach this thorny issue. The first would be to go back to Voltaire's own writings. This is not the path I will tread today, as the field is already rich with scholarship, some seeking to defend Voltaire's humanism, others more lucid about the blind spots in his anti-Judaism. I will simply note that my position is broadly in line with the nuanced and critical perspectives of Adam Sutcliffe and Harvey Chisig, among others, and you have some bibliography here. Voltaire's anti-Judaism is real and pervasive, but it should not be confused with the racial anti-Semitism of the 19th and 20th century. Rather, it falls under what I will call the pathologies of universalism. For Voltaire, Jews represented an excessive attachment to the past, to community, to ritual. At a certain point, liberalism, conceived as abstract individualism, can take on an intolerant edge towards those unwilling to abandon their traditions. It is also worth underscoring that Voltaire is not representative of the Enlightenment as a whole, but rather as one particular way of envisioning universalism and emancipation, and we know there were several ways, as Maurice Samuels has shown. The main question I wish to address today is how the theme of Voltaire's anti-Semitism managed to worm its way into public debate in the 20th century. Just after Voltaire's death, during the heated debates over emancipation, Voltaire's hostility toward Jews was common knowledge. Yet, this aspect of his thought later faded into oblivion. For a fairly obvious reason, the political polarization of Voltaire's legacy. For the nationalists and anti-Semites at the end of the 19th century, such as Édouard Drummond, Voltaire could not be a reference point. On the contrary, he was seen as an ideological adversary. And conversely, for Republican or Jewish intellectuals, Voltaire was the man who had defended the Protestant Jean Calas, and he was a symbol of the Republic's emancipatory mission. His attacks on Jews can only be chalked up to his battle against the Bible, and thus against the Hebrew roots of Christian monotheism and religious fanaticism. By the late 1930s, a handful of Voltaire's quotations began to crop up in anti-Semitic discourse. But the main tipping point came in 1942 under the Vichy government with a book entitled Voltaire anti-juif, edited by Henri Labroux. This was a patchwork of Voltaire's writings cobbled together to establish his animosity toward Jews, not to accuse him, of course, but rather to show that the anti-Semitic persecutions carried out by Vichy were not a German import, but had their roots in a French tradition of anti-Semitism, of which Voltaire was a prestigious figure. And the book was really insidious, as it was presented as a straightforward anthology of Voltaire's writings, and yet, in fact, the text was cherry-picked, sometimes misleadingly presented, and Labroux added subheadings that steered the reader toward a one-sided interpretation of ambiguous texts. The move to co-opt Voltaire to justify Vichy anti-Semitism may seem odd at first glance. The author's own trajectory offers some clues. Henri Labroue, born in Bergerac in the southwest of France in 1880, was trained as a historian. He wrote a thesis on the French Revolution. For many years, he was a man of the left, a Freemason, a radical Republican deputy in 1914, and a member of the League for Human Rights. Here, for example, you can see a political portrait for the election in 1912, when he was a young Republican. He later became a lawyer, and prior to 1939, he was not known for holding anti-Semitic views. However, at the outset of the war, he joined the Vichy's authorities and became a die-hard anti-Semite. He founded a Jewish Studies Institute in Bordeaux and penned his Voltaire anti-Juif. He was even awarded by the Vichy government a chair in History of Judaism at the Sorbonne. Labroue's political past explains his choice of Voltaire. He took a former radical Republican and Freemason who had crossed over to collaboration to annex Voltaire to the literary heritage of the far right. By moving from the left to collaboration, Labroue brought Voltaire along with him, lending lasting credibility to the theme of Voltaire as an anti-Semite and providing the accusation with a ready-made record of quotations. After the war, Labroue was sentenced to 20 years in prison for collaboration. But his book continued to cast a long shadow. On the one hand, it remained a reference for the far right and was even reissued 10 years ago by a neo-Nazi publisher. On the other hand, it was often picked up uncritically by academic authors who were not Voltaire specialists but wrote on the history of anti-Semitism. A troubling and significant case is that of the eminent French historian of Russian origin, Léon Poliakov. A former member of the resistance, Poliakov was one of the first to write about the Shoah, notably in his great book Bréviaire de la haine, published in 1951. He later published a sweeping history of anti-Semitism, the third volume of which was submitted as a doctoral thesis under the supervision of Raymond Aron, who was also the editor of Bréviaire de la haine. Published in 1968, it presented Voltaire as, I quote, the prototype of the modern anti-Semite. Poliakov relied heavily on Labroue's book, describing him simply as a certified historian, agrégé d'histoire, without mentioning his Vichist affiliations. Poliakov concluded that emancipated Jews were mistaken in seeing Voltaire as a champion of tolerance. He wrote, I quote, always massacred, they only saw Voltaire as the flag bearer of bourgeois, pacific, and secular democracy without suspecting that the crushing of the infame would lead, via as many intermediaries as one could wish, to far vaster massacres. Despite the somewhat offhand parenthesis, the phrase links the Enlightenment and the Shoah, not in broad and general terms, but through the specific issue of anti-Semitic thought. By drawing on the quotation compiled by Labroue, Poliakov gave a highly legitimate seal of approval to the theme of Voltaire as an anti-Semite. But above all, he broadened the diagnosis. Anti-Judaism was not unique to Voltaire. It was rather the secret guilt of the Enlightenment, identified as the source of modern anti-Semitism and leading to the destruction of the Jews. Because of Poliakov's stellar reputation and moral authority, his book greatly contributed to popularizing this argument, especially when the critique of the ideology of progress and the Enlightenment became fashionable. Taguieff, Pierre-André Taguieff, whom I mentioned earlier, frequently refers to Poliakov, whom he regards as a mentor. Taguieff's idea of a Voltairean moment as the wellspring of modern Judeophobia has, for some years now, gone hand in hand with his own ideological shift to the right and his critique of progressive anti-racist discourses as breeding grounds for anti-Semitism. In 1968, at the very moment Polyakov's book was hitting the shelves in France, another important work was published across the Atlantic, taking Voltaire to task for modern anti-Semitism. The French Enlightenment and the Jews was the work of the American scholar and Rabbi Arthur Herzberg. Like Polyakov, he insisted on the ambivalence of the Enlightenment philosopher toward the Jews and make Voltaire the chief culprit. According to Herzberg, Voltaire was responsible for having laid the groundwork for contemporary anti-Semitism. I quote, Voltaire, he provided the fundamentals of the rhetoric of secular anti-Semitism. His role in history was that of the crucial architect of the ambivalences that surrounding the Emancipation. His work was made a fundamental contribution to its debacle. For Herzberg, Voltaire anti-Semitism could not be reduced to his rejection of monotheism. It was indeed modern Jews he attacked, and he saw them, the Jews, as outsiders to the European tradition rooted in Greco-Roman antiquity. They were perceived as heirs to Oriental fanaticism and therefore unassimilable to the enlightened Europe Voltaire was envisioning. Consequently, they became the designated victims of a new exclusion, this time in the name of reason and tolerance. It is important to note that in Herzberg's perspective, Voltaire was not a liberal, unlike Montesquieu, because he had an absolutist conception of historical progress. Now, there remains, I guess, a lot of work to be done on the influence of Herzberg's book on the image of Voltaire and the French Enlightenment, especially among American Jews. And I'm sure that many of you know much more about this than I do, and I would be delighted to hear your insights and learn more about Herzberg's legacy in the US. What I have tried to show, all too briefly, is that the debate over Voltaire's anti-Semitism is not just a matter of literary scholarship. It has also recent political history. For both Polyakov and Herzberg, Voltaire, in the final analysis, is little more than a pretext. The real aim is to lay bare the roots of modern anti-Semitism in the Enlightenment, and thus in the progressive discourse inherited from the 18th century and the French Revolution. Of course, we can agree that it is important to face up to the limits of the modern emancipation discourse, and Voltaire's work is a good tool to deconstruct the idea of a natural bond between Enlightenment liberalism and Jewish emancipation. This is not at all an illegitimate undertaking, but it must be conducted with the utmost nuance and caution. Above all, we must be keenly aware of the pitfalls of political instrumentalization that such an operation entails. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. The title of my talk is Freedom of Religion and the First Liberals, Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant on Judaism. And I thought I'd just quickly explain to you why I'm calling Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant the first liberals. It's because they were among the very first to be called that at the time, to be called liberals, the plural of the noun liberal. And they were the first to theorize and espouse something called liberalism at the time. The word was coined in around 1812 to refer to the cluster of principles they fought for, namely the rule of law, civil equality, constitutional representative government, and a number of individual rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, as well as the right to private property. Madame de Staël was the only daughter of Suzanne and Jacques Necker, Genevan banker and finance minister to the King of France. She was one of the richest heiresses in Europe and ran her own salon, which was one of the most politically influential in Paris. Madame de Staël is still most famous for her novels, but she wrote and co-wrote speeches and articles for the men that she guided and promoted with her money and connections. She wrote a book on passions, and she wrote path-breaking literary criticism. Like her father, she was an admirer of the English Constitution and wanted to bring something similar to France. Very active politically during the early years of the Revolution, she later became an opponent, a fierce opponent of Napoleon. Benjamin Constant is better known among political theorists today. He was Madame de Staël's protégé, intellectual partner, and for a long time her lover as well. He was a complete unknown when she brought him to Paris, and under her guidance and with her support, he became a prolific political thinker, journalist, and scholar. He wrote a political treatise today regarded as foundational for liberalism and delivered a speech now regarded as a liberal classic. And eventually he also served as a deputy in the chamber. When he passed away in 1830, he was given a state funeral for his services to constitutionalism in France. For our purposes today, it's perhaps most relevant that Benjamin Constant wrote a 5-volume book on religion, as well as several articles on the topic. Madame de Staël's very similar views are sprinkled throughout her writings. So what was their view of Judaism? Let me start with an episode from Madame de Staël's blockbuster best-selling novel of 1807, Corinne. We learn at the outset of the novel that Oswald, a handsome Scottish nobleman, endowed with a fine mind, a great name, and an independent fortune, has fallen ill, and doctors have prescribed the air of the south to make him better. On his way to southern Italy, he stops at the port town of Ancona. One night, Oswald hears terrible screams coming from the town and sees a huge fire spreading rapidly from house to house. He runs toward the flames to see what he can do to help. He finds the local population paralyzed with fear. Some are lying heads down on the ground with their coats over their heads. Others have dazed looked on their faces and stand there motionless. Church bells are ringing, and priests are forming a procession through town. Women are weeping, but no one is doing anything useful to put out the fire. Oswald leaps into action. He locates some pumps and manages to get the flames under control. Suddenly, he hears even more horrible screams coming from the other side of town. He asks where they're coming from and is told that they're coming from the Jewish quarter. The police, we learn, were in the habit of locking its gates every evening, and the fire was now closing in on the Jews. They were trapped. Oswald immediately demands that the gates be open and the Jews be set free. But the women, writes Madame de Staël, quote, flung themselves at his feet, exclaiming, "Don't you see, good angel, that it's certainly because of the presence of the Jews that we have had this fire? It is they who bring us misfortune, and if you set them free, all the water of the sea will not put out the flames." They beg Oswald to simply let the Jews burn. Oswald, brave, selfless, and not incidentally Protestant, can barely contain his indignation and has the gates of the ghetto smashed open, and he liberates the Jews. Although they wrote little explicitly about Judaism, Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant both advocated the utter freedom of worship for all sects. But it's not because they didn't have a preference. They both preferred an enlightened form of Protestantism and said so openly. It was the religion that Madame de Staël had been brought up in and that Constant had imbibed in Scotland when he studied there as a young man. This was an enlightened, liberal, or what scholars today call post-Orthodox Calvinism, which had shed many of its traditional dogmas and was now more focused on fostering good morals in this world than worrying about the afterlife. The main focus of Madame de Staël and Constant was the Catholic Church, which had been and continued to be a good friend and support to absolute monarchy, and in their view was stifling progress in every realm, even causing the stupefaction and the moral degradation of the French population, as Benjamin Constant said. They regarded Catholicism as a superstitious and backward religion that taught blind faith, made people fearful and weak, and preached a form of obedience and subservience inimical to a liberal political regime. When Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant advocated freedom of religion, they did so for a specific reason. It was not because they appreciated diversity for diversity's sake, nor for the reason that freedom of religion might end religious wars and conflicts. They advocated religious freedom because they thought it would create something like a free market in religion. Free competition between religions, they imagined, would gradually bring about a progressive reformation. Eventually, you would see the victory of the enlightened form of Protestantism they both professed. Although Constant is the one who articulated this theory most lengthily in his writings, it was a theory they both shared. Religion was not meant to be stationary or timeless. Religion was progressive or perfectible, according to Madame de Staël. All religions, they thought, were composed of an inner moral core, something they called religious sentiment or feeling, and an outer dogmatic shell. If left free from interference by a priesthood or government, religions would naturally evolve over time, progressively shedding their outmoded forms and taking on more enlightened ones. True religion, Madame de Staël wrote, was independent of dogmas and rites, which were only accidental forms that the times create and destroy. This is the animating principle of Constant's monumental work on religion, considered in its source, its forms, and developments. He adapted an idea he got from the latest German Protestant theology that he studied on his several trips to Germany. Today, scholars refer to it as the theory of accommodation or progressive revelation. It goes something like this. God's revelation comes to man not all at once, but in stages. God proportions or adapts revelation to the intellectual and moral state of man. The Jewish revelation was good for the period in which it appeared, but the Jews were soon ready for a purer, higher form of religion. Thus, we got Christianity. Catholicism was also good for a time. It brought some important improvements. But once Catholicism had done its work, it was time for Protestantism. Eventually, humanity would be ready for what Madame de Staël called the Reformation of the Reformation, an even higher form of religion. Constant writes that religion is shackled when forms are prevented from changing or evolving by priesthoods and governments who control and obstruct the revolution for political reasons of control. Religions must be allowed to accommodate themselves to the progressive moral tendency of the day and thus help to improve the moral dignity of people. If religion were only allowed to be free, it would become more liberal. People would also become more liberal, more tolerant and generous, more moral, less selfish. We certainly do not class ourselves among the vilifiers of Mosaic law, Constant writes in one of his articles. We by no means forget the superiority of its doctrine over every religion of that day. Eventually, however, it was constraining because, for example, of the, quote, almost total absence of ideas on the nature of the soul and on the soul's immortality, and Judaism's view of God as despotic, suspicious, and jealous, and finally, its multiplicity of rites and practices. The religion of the Hebrews was a step in the right direction, but it was only a step. Perhaps this theory explains a curious and disturbing ending to the episode from Corinne that I recounted earlier. As soon as the Jews were liberated, Madame de Staël tells us that they actually ran back into the fire to get their merchandise. One could see them, she said, quote, running to their wares in the midst of the flames, with a greed for wealth that seems sinister when it leads to defiance of death. Here we encounter a cultural stereotype to which Madame de Staël seems not to have been immune. In her story, only the Protestant Oswald comes out well. The Jews of Ancona are materialistic and greedy. The Catholics are superstitious and cruel. And only the enlightened Protestant is to be admired. But to this early liberal, there should be no government interference, no repression, no intolerance. The invisible hand of a free market in religion will bring about the desired outcome. So some concluding thoughts. Madame de Staël's ideas merit being placed in historical context and compared with the measures that Napoleon wanted and did impose the very time her novel was being written and published. When Napoleon conquered Italy during the 1790s, he actually liberated the Jews of Ancona. That is, he opened their ghetto. But in 1806, 7, and 8, and I know you're more of an expert than I am on this, he implemented punitive disciplinary measures ostensibly to force the Jews to integrate. He suspended the payment of debts to them. He forbade certain types of commerce. He stipulated government supervision of their business dealings and restricted their movement. He even wanted to require that one Jewish marriage in 3 be an intermarriage, apparently to dilute Jewish blood. You find nothing of this in Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant. They agreed, they wanted assimilation. Their thinking obviously means that Judaism is going to hopefully disappear, but it was going to happen gradually, naturally, and peacefully.
I'd like to thank Maury and Sam for the invitation to participate in this conference and for the distinguished company in which I find myself. My talk is entitled The Invention of Emancipation Politics, which is really an attempt to rehabilitate Jewish liberalism in the 19th century. In the long 19th century, Jewish leaders in Europe and the United States created a distinct emancipation politics, a specifically Jewish version of liberalism, in the effort first to gain equal rights and then to defend them. Conventional textbook accounts date the origins of modern Jewish politics to the Russian pogroms of 1881-1882, and the response of Jews being socialism, the General Jewish Labor Bund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, first met in 1897, and nationalism, the First Zionist Congress, also 1897, and diaspora nationalism or autonomism coalesced around the Russian Revolution of 1905. The conventional accounts deny that Jewish leaders and communal institutions engaged in actual politics to gain emancipation, instead recognizing 2 non-political endeavors. First, the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, as a pedagogical movement aiming to re-educate Jews for citizenship, and second, the reform of Judaism that transformed Judaism into a confession appropriate to a multi-confessional polity. In contrast, I will demonstrate that 19th century emancipationists in fact generated a distinct politics that utilized liberalism's practices and institutions. The key examples are communal institutions, lawyers, and the press, as well as philanthropic and civil defense organizations. Communal organization. Much scholarship still asserts that no organization replaced the early modern autonomous community or kehillah, the corporate entity that reforming states necessarily dismantled in granting emancipation. In this view, emancipation resulted in the privatization of Jewish life. In fact, not only did new communal institutions emerge, but they were politically engaged. Let's take the example of the French Consistoire, the centralized organization that Napoleon created in 1808. The Consistoire was politically active from the start. It opposed the renewal of Napoleon's infamous decree in 1818, petitioning the government and lobbying high officials. It organized opposition to the imposition of the discriminatory oath for Jews, the Mora Judaico. Consistory rabbis refused to administer the oath, and the consistory went to court multiple times, finally winning a 3-decade campaign to prohibit the oath. The Consistoire successfully petitioned for state salaries for rabbis in 1831, making them equal to Protestant and Catholic clergy. Lawyers. More dramatic and largely unrecognized was the new politics of lawyers who transformed emancipation into a juridical issue by holding the state responsible for failing either to introduce or enforce the principles of uniformity of law and equality before the law. Lawyers thereby introduced a new chapter in the history of a key dictum of diaspora Jewish politics, the law of the land is law, dina de malchuta dina, by treating state law not as a static object, as hitherto had been the case, but as a dynamic entity subject to change. They demanded that the state ameliorate itself. These lawyers only appeared with the partial or full emancipation that permitted Jews to study in university law faculties and gain admission to the bar. A prime example is Gabriel Rieser, 1806 to 1863, who became the self-appointed public champion of emancipation throughout Central Europe by writing pamphlets, publishing articles in the press, engaging in public debates, and petitioning states. During the 1848 revolution, Rieser was elected to the Frankfurt Assembly and served as vice president, where he insisted that Jews be granted rights through general legislation as a matter of principle rather than through special laws. Genrich Schliasberg, 1863 to 1937, was, quote, the defender of the Jewish people in Tsarist Russia. He began by advocating in court against the state's arbitrary revocation of Jews' residential privileges, both within and outside the Pale of Settlement. He joined with other Jewish lawyers in a defense bureau in 1900 that brought lawsuits against pogromists, both civilians and state officials, as well as providing counsel for the accused in blood libel cases, especially the Bayless case of 1911. His unwavering commitment was to force the Tsarist government to uphold the rule of law. Press. If lawyers represented the first new practice of emancipation politics, the vernacular Jewish press was its first new institution. Ludwig Philippson, 1811 to 1889, inaugurated the vernacular Jewish press with his Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums in 1837, which had two goals: external emancipation through legal equality and internal emancipation through the reform of Jews and Judaism. The Allgemeine Zeitung fostered a Jewish public opinion. Philippson made the petition a favored instrument, repeatedly organizing petitions among the German states' multiple Jewish community organizations. He campaigned on behalf of emancipation in other countries, even meeting with the Turkish ambassador in Paris in 1856. Similar newspapers appeared across Europe and in the United States. The philanthropic diplomatic complex. The second new institution of emancipation politics was the philanthropic diplomatic complex. In the first half of the 19th century, emancipationists throughout Europe founded schools and voluntary associations to support emancipation. Just after mid-century, in 1859-1860, emancipationists in two countries founded the first civil defense organizations. The proximate cause was the Mortara Affair in Bologna in 1858, in which the church in a papal state seized a young boy whose nursemaid claimed to have secretly baptized him during an infant illness and refused to return him to his family. The Board of Delegates of American Israelites was founded in 1859 to defend Jews' rights in the United States and abroad. The Alliance Israélite Universelle usually advertises the first such organization, but in fact the second was founded in 1860. The Alliance's raison d'etre was explicitly emancipationist, quote, to work everywhere for the emancipation and spiritual progress of the Jews, to lend effective aid to those who suffer because they are Jews, to encourage all publications likely to lead to this result. In response to the new organized political anti-Semitism in the century's closing decades, emancipationists founded a second wave of civil defense organizations. The Austrian Israelite Union, the Österreichische Israelitische Union, 1886, significantly established a legal defense committee that metamorphosed into a full-fledged legal defense bureau whose goal was to provide, quote, legal aid without cost in all cases where the constitutional rights of the Jews as such are discriminated against. In Germany, emancipationists established the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Persuasion, 1893, whose founders held that since the anti-Semitic political parties threatened to revoke emancipation, Jews as citizens needed to mount a public campaign to defend their legal equality with all available legal means, especially a legal defense department that aimed to force the judicial system to afford Jews equal protection. In the United States, emancipationists founded the American Jewish Committee in 1906 that aimed, quote, to prevent infringement of the civil and religious rights of Jews and to alleviate the consequences of persecution. Emancipationist women's organizations emerged in the same period, including in Central Europe the Jewish Women's League, the Jüdische Frauenbund, and in the United States the National Council of Jewish Women in 1893. These organizations began to convene international conferences, in the first instance to lobby the Romanian government over its refusal to grant Jews citizenship. A conference convened in Brussels in 1872, which the Board of Delegates of American Israelites celebrated as an unprecedented event in the campaign for citizenship. A second conference convened in Paris in 1876. These efforts culminated at the Congress of Berlin in 1878 that required Romania to cease using religious creed as a criterion to deny civil and political rights. This high point of diplomacy was unfortunately a paper victory since Romania refused to implement the article. The mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe also elicited new organizations and international conferences. Ludwig Philipson, the Alliance, and the Board of Delegates of American Israelites convened a conference in 1869 to respond to the first wave of immigrants. In 1882, leaders convened a second conference in Berlin. Neither of these conferences yielded conclusive results. An international conference in 1904 in Frankfurt founded a central office for Jewish immigration that established border stations and communication centers to assist East European Jews transiting through Germany. Representatives protected the emigrants' rights, most of whom were stateless, as well as providing services such as kosher food. Emancipationists espoused a tripartite credo. First, a fundamental rehabilitation of poor Jews through education and new occupations. This was the emancipationist version of liberal capacitarianism. Second, emancipationists recognized the state's primacy and civil law's supremacy. This was the Sanhedrin ideology, the answers Jewish leaders, lay and rabbinic, gave at Napoleon's Assembly of Notables in Sanhedrin between 1806 and 1808. Third, Judaism was to become one religion alongside others in a society comprised of multiple confessions. The emancipationists envisioned the erection of a religiously plural polity built on an inclusive concept of citizenship. The emancipationist foundational ideas and political praxis yielded two fundamental paradoxes. First, were Jews to gain rights on principle through the state's amelioration or by proving their utility through self-emancipation? Most emancipationists insisted on the two claims' mutual compatibility, that through their public and private politics, Jews endeavored to motivate the state to alter itself, help them to live with this paradox. Second, solidarity versus self-interest. When Jews interceded on behalf of fellow Jews abroad, were they acting out of altruistic solidarity or calculated self-interest? For most emancipationists, the two goals were compatible. In conclusion, emancipationists created an identifiable and robust politics during the 19th century that was a particularist version of liberalism. They devised practices and institutions that were foundational for all subsequent Jewish political movements. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Maurice and to Sam for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. In my comments today, I want to offer some reflections on our theme in the case of Hungary. So under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Hungary has become the model for a liberal democracy everywhere, including for the Trump administration, which is trying to emulate Hungarian achievements in many fields of policy. And in Hungary, we can also see with particular clarity what we might call the new politics of anti-Semitism at work. Viktor Orban and his allies repeatedly slander their opponents with thinly veiled anti-Semitic tropes as leftist cosmopolitans who don't know the meaning of nation, country, or Christianity. And they have found ways to commemorate the Holocaust while obscuring any Hungarian complicity in the genocide. At the same time, though, Hungary presents itself as a state committed to fighting anti-Semitism and to defending European values against Islamic replacement, gender ideology, cultural Marxism, and liberal Eurocrats in Brussels. Most significantly, it has built excellent relations with the Netanyahu government in Israel. Last year, Israel's diaspora affairs minister praised Hungary for its, quote, robust conservative leadership that ensures that Jews can walk through the streets safely, unlike in other European capitals. And in early April, Hungary withdrew from the International Criminal Court in order to welcome Benjamin Netanyahu to Budapest on an official state visit. To understand the dynamics shaping the place of anti-Semitism in the current crisis of liberalism in Hungary, we need to consider, I think, its deep roots in another and much earlier moment of crisis that began at the turn of the 20th century. So in my short paper, I'll describe that earlier crisis and then consider some of the ways it continues to resonate today. So first, the scene. Between 1867 and 1918, Hungary was ruled by a liberal oligarchy that revered the memory of Lajos Kossuth and the revolution of 1848 as a glorious vision of national emancipation from Habsburg tyranny. These were decades of rapid economic growth, when Hungary's noble elite, in partnership with a largely Jewish financial and commercial class, championed free trade within the empire and the promotion of Hungarian exports globally. For their part, the country's Jewish-Hungarian bourgeoisie, embodiments of the Magyar-Jewish symbiosis celebrated in popular movies like Sunshine, also zealously embraced the dominant memory of 1848. In public and in private, they cherished the memory of Jews who had fought alongside Kossuth, and they celebrated the revolution as an ideal of progress, religious freedom, and civic equality for all. By the end of the 19th century, however, a young generation of radical students, journalists, writers, and scientists had begun to argue that liberal Hungary was rotten to the core. These young critics said that Kossuth and his fellow 48ers had emancipated the peasants but had refused to break up the latifundia that gave the nobility its power over them. Industrial development had only widened the gap between rich and poor. Radicals also accused the country's elites of cementing their power by appealing to nationalist chauvinism, counting Jews as loyal Hungarians while discriminating against Romanians, Slovaks, and other ethnic minorities. Hungary, these critics said, had learned the wrong lessons from 1848. As one of them, the librarian and journalist Ervin Sobol put it, the official history of the revolution, quote, does not offer insights which can be utilized in mapping out the roads to a better future. Characterizing the critical circles in which these ideas circulated can be challenging. They included young men who later became well-known outside Hungary, like Georg Lukács, Karl Polanyi, Béla Balázs, as well as figures like Ervin Sobol or Anna Lesnai, who are less well-known outside Hungary, but no less important there. In one of the very best histories of this milieu, Mary Gluck observes that most of Hungary's young radicals considered themselves socialist primarily as a way of distinguishing themselves from a nationalist liberalism they believed to be outdated. Socialism, one of them wrote, quote, picked up the thread where liberalism dropped it. Some were, or became, or were, and then were not Marxists. Others ascribed so many different and individualized meanings to socialism that its content became diluted, according to Gluck, and often meant little more than a concern with the social question. Many of them turned to sociology as a way of understanding and diagnosing the social and economic inequalities that plagued Hungary. All of them hoped to recover the sense of transformative possibility they believed had been betrayed in 1848. Most of these young radicals were Jews. Very few of them said much about their families or about the role that Jewish traditions or faith played in them, and few of them ever presented themselves publicly as Jews. And yet so many of Budapest's fin de siècle left radicals came from the same urban Jewish bourgeois social milieu and were connected by overlapping family and friendship networks. Connecting the dots can be a fascinating exercise. For example, Ervin Sobol, who wrote the still to this day most important radical history of 1848 in Hungary, was a cousin of Karl Polanyi's. Another cousin was one of Georg Lukács's first girlfriends. And still another cousin helped to found the Hungarian Communist Party at the end of World War I. These radicals met in the homes of family members, or they gathered in public places like cafes or editorial offices that in Budapest were coded as Jewish spaces at the time, even when those spaces were also frequented by non-Jews. The world that this specific leftist Jewish made this specific leftist Jewish milieu possible shattered in 1918. The Habsburg monarchy collapsed, neighboring states seized more than two-thirds of historic Hungarian territory, and a hope-filled democratic revolution quickly buckled under the pressures of mass economic and social dislocation. By March 1919, a Bolshevik regime took power and then ruled the country for 3.5 months. In this maelstrom, Hungary's radicals fragmented in 100 different ideological directions. Some embraced the Bolshevik regime wholeheartedly. Others supported it as the only progressive option available, even when they had profound intellectual and moral misgivings. Still others saw Bolshevism as a death blow to their dreams of a more democratic Hungary and fled the country. And more than a few of Hungary's brightest radical minds died in these months from the influenza pandemic. In 1918-19, defeat, state collapse, and revolutionary upheaval ended a remarkable chapter in Hungarian intellectual history. But the idea that the post-war revolutions had been a Jewish affair persisted. This brings me to a second point. Counter-revolutionaries seized on the visibility of Jews among the Bolshevik leadership to condemn the Bolshevik Revolution as a Jewish plot. But the specter of Judeo-Bolshevism was more than a device to scapegoat Jews for defeat and the loss of national land. It was also, and fundamentally, an intellectual strategy to redefine the history of liberalism in Hungary as a mistake that had led to disaster. After 1919, right-wing intellectuals debated the causes of the catastrophe that had befallen the country. They began with the premise that Hungarians had always fought as a nation to defend their sovereignty since the founding of the state in the year 1000. 1848, they argued, was one episode among many in this long history. But Hungarian liberals had hijacked this noble legacy. Infatuated by Western European ideals of toleration and individual equality, they had welcomed Jews into Hungary, and they had allowed them to replace ancient national traditions with a destructive and modern Jewish spirit. In this telling, the hegemonic liberal nationalism of the late Habsburg Empire and the critique advanced by the fin de siècle radicals were two faces of the same Jewish power. Both undermined the nation's will to defend its sovereignty, and in this fantasy of historical decline, Jewish Bolsheviks came on the stage only in the last act to deliver the final blow. As one contributor to an early counter-revolutionary assessment of Hungary's Bolshevik regime put it, a thin wall separated radicalism from Bolshevism, and this wall, quote, collapsed at the point where the Jews found each other. The myth of Judeo-Bolshevism cast a long shadow over Hungarian political life throughout the 20th century. Judeo-Bolshevism became a reason for anti-Semitic laws. It was used to justify the deportation of Jewish Hungarians on German trains bound for Auschwitz. And it fueled paranoia after the Holocaust that communist power was nothing more than Jewish revenge. Afterwards, the popular association of communism with Jews led Hungary's post-1945 communist rulers to instrumentalize anti-Semitism in order to appear legitimate in the eyes of the people they claimed to lead. But perhaps most significantly, Judeo-Bolshevism split interwar intellectual opposition to the counter-revolutionary regime into two distinct tendencies. One group, who often came from rural backgrounds, called themselves populists and dreamed of transforming Hungary into an ethno-national democracy. They insisted that their ideas about social change were authentically Hungarian, rooted in the life of the people, and had nothing in common with cosmopolitan, read Jewish or Jewish Bolshevik, notions of progress. And they distinguished themselves from the country's tiny post-revolutionary milieu of left liberal and socialist intellectuals who were largely Budapest-based, often Jewish, and popularly labeled as urbanists. The tensions between populists and urbanists shaped intellectual life in Hungary from the 1930s into the early post-war period. And it remained a deep background hum that colored the formation of dissident circles in Hungary in the 1980s. Writing for the New York Review of Books in 1985, Timothy Garton Ash noted that writers concerned with the fate of ethnic Hungarian minorities abroad, places like Romania, tended to keep themselves apart from the circles in which the country's left liberal and often Jewish dissidents gathered. Ash confessed that this seemed like a caricature to him, and yet he found it curious that, quote, the question urbanist or populist was still as important as the question officially favored or dissident. After 1989, the tendencies expressed by the labels urbanist and populist mapped themselves onto the post-communist political spectrum. In time, Viktor Orban's Fidesz party claimed the intellectual heritage of the populist tradition, jettisoned its nostalgia for rural life, and remade its ethno-nationalism into an ideology for an illiberal democracy that is xenophobic, anti-EU, and hostile to international norms regarding civil liberties and cultural pluralism. At the same time, the Orban regime has turned the famous quip of Karl Lueger, I decide who is a Jew, on its head. It now decides who is an anti-Semite. On the one hand, Hungarian officials again tars the left as anti-national cosmopolitans. They accuse it of exploiting Holocaust memory to win points in Brussels, and they allege that the left gins up charges of anti-Semitism to stifle healthy expressions of national pride. On the other hand, Orban and his intellectual allies have begun to refer more often to Hungary's place in the Judeo-Christian civilization of the West. It's not a phrase that has deep roots in Hungarian thought. It is instead, I think, an import from the United States, which the Hungarian right uses to bolster the claim that they, and not their opponents on the left, are the real defenders of Western values, including the fight against anti-Semitism. To demonstrate its anti-Semitic credentials, this is my last point, the Orban regime has tried to imagine into being a vision of Jewish life in Hungary that is compatible with its illiberal politics. In this project, they have found a political partner in Chabad, which has poured significant resources into invigorating Jewish life in Hungary. In 2019, Hungary officially recognized Chabad's umbrella organization called the Orthodox Jewish Communities Association, or EMIH, making it eligible to receive government support. Backed by Chabad funding, EMIH is now an active presence in Hungarian Jewish congregational life. At least 5 synagogues have been inaugurated in the last few years. The executive rabbi of EMIH has also agreed to take over the stalled creation of a controversial government-sponsored Holocaust museum called the House of Fates. And in 2018, EMIH bought the former King Sigismund College on the northern edge of the Budapest city limits, which it renamed, and I'm not making this up, the Milton Friedman University. The university's programs are secular and, according to its website, quote, competitive and market-oriented. But EMIH received a large grant from the Hungarian government to start a Jewish studies program, which the Ministry of Education approved in February. There are plans for religious education and rabbinical training as well. Meanwhile, the government dismisses long-established rival Hungarian Jewish organizations with roots in the communist era as outdated and infected by leftist ideology. Will any of this lead to a renaissance of Jewish life in Hungary? It's too soon to say. But these strategies have put Hungary at the forefront of illiberal regimes that are successfully manipulating anti-Semitism to demonize the left, elevate Jewish allies on the right, and claim legitimacy as champions of Western civilization. We should not be surprised when others try to follow its example. Thank you.
Okay, we are now open for questions. So please make your intent to ask a question known, and I will try and keep order.
Yeah, we're going to pass, raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. And again, we do ask for concise questions that are really fast. Thank you all. That was a perfect way, I think, to start the conference and to give us this historical basis. So thank you. A question for Antoine. I thought that was so interesting, what you were showing about the kind of dubious origins of some of the critiques of Voltaire. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the content of the critique of Polyakov and Herzberg. I mean, Voltaire did say those things. So, how do you read his anti-Semitism? If you could just say a little bit more.
Thank you very much. Yeah, of course, Voltaire did say these things, but the term that Polyakov and Herzberg made was to identify Voltaire's critique of Jews as the source of modern racial anti-Semitism. And this, I think, is strongly disputable. Because there's a lot of things you can say about Voltaire's Judeophobia, but it's not racial. It's much more about, and it's not a call to persecutions, not at all. So, and it's much more ambivalent in Voltaire's thought, because it was, on the one hand, a call for tolerance, a liberal call for tolerance, and on the other hand, it was the sort of dialectic of tolerance. When tolerance, if Jews are the symbol of intolerance, so they can be seen as a threat to the Enlightenment. So those some awful things that Voltaire wrote about Jews, but also some more moderate, I think. And I think that Polyakov and Ellsberg, differently but both, because of the influence of the Shoah, but also of the writings of Labroue, they have this vision of Voltaire's writing, not only as a sort of pathologies of universalism, but also as the beginning of a new secular and racial anti-Semitism.
Professor Nakhimovsky, you'll choose.
So my question's for Paul, and this may only be of interest to the three of us in the room who are Hungary specialists, but for those of us who are, one thing that really struck me in your discussion of the lasting influence of the populist movement is the way in which the split between ruralism and urbanism and the various different bifurcations that implies resonate and follow through in the way that the Orban government talks about George Soros. And I'm wondering if that has been made explicit in the way, not just, I wouldn't see the government doing this, but in perhaps the way that government-aligned intellectuals have talked about these issues or sort of their allies have. Or if not, if it's not made explicit, do you think there's a significant influence, given sort of ironically that the targeting of Soros didn't start organically with the Hungarian government, but rather as a suggestion of American consultants?
Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I understand the question, it's what I would say is tracing the history of the populist intellectuals of the 30s into the present is kind of tricky, because if you actually look at what they wrote about in the 30s, it's very much about, raising up a group of people that don't really exist anymore, sort of a peasantry. But if you sort of dig deeper into it, there are lots of themes about sort of, who is authentically Hungarian, that these people must be the sovereign people. And I think that if you think about it as a kind of a collection of sort of sentiments and an orientation, that is, even if not explicitly referred to, I think, kind of lives on in the sort of the intellectual apparatus of people in the kind of, Orban camp. Certainly the kinds of writers who, are sort of articulating that vision that for Hungary's place in the world that Orban wants to present his belonging.
Thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed all of the different presentations. A question for Professor Bell. Professor Bell, you opened up by suggesting that philo-Semitism contains within it this sort of tendency towards eliminating Jewish difference. And I wanted to just give you the opportunity to clarify the conceptual connection a little bit more. I see how there were various people whom you discussed who expressed sympathy with the Jewish situation, generally speaking, in pre-revolutionary France, and yet nonetheless managed to, at least many of them, wanted Jewish difference ultimately to be eliminated. But is there something about philo-Semitism in itself that leads to that kind of outcome, or is it something that just as a matter of the contingent historical circumstances, various people who embraced a philo-Semitic stance also happen to be opposed to Jewish difference?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think I'm certainly I would think of myself as much more an expert in the French Enlightenment than on the history of anti-Semitism in general. So take whatever I say with a very large grain of salt here. But I would say that implicitly, if there's a question of admiring the Jews, which is certainly an aspect of philo-Semitism, what do you admire them for? Do you admire them for particular qualities that make them, that make them often particularly powerful, particularly influential, that obviously then contains the grains of a possible anti-Semitic reaction if you become suspicious of that power, of that influence. So I put that very simply there, that I think that is certainly one very simple and for me at least very clear connection, which comes out, certainly at the time of the French Revolution, but then you can see this actually in the kind of things that Professor Hanebrink was talking about also for Hungary. That you could imagine that the Jews are particularly good at certain things, and then you become nervous about the way that they're going to actually use that influence, they're going to use that power, and then you become scared of them and you feel that they have to be taken out of society. Or there can be simply the admiration, again, that I talked about, that goes back to Rousseau, and of course goes way before Rousseau, admiration for the Jews being able to preserve their particular rights, their particular language, their particular customs, and of course their religion in the midst of diaspora. And that too then becomes, as certainly it was for Rousseau, a problem, because, you could admire them for doing so, but when they're actually there in the midst of you and they're sort of disturbing and perturbing the society in which they live, then it also becomes a problem. So I think that these things are very, very much linked, and then that kind of philo-Semitism can very easily translate into anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. I have two very direct quick questions. The first is to Professor Bell. And when I hear the New Israel and enslavement, I think immediately of Christian supersessionism and anti-Judaism. Yeah. And so I wanted to know, is Rousseau sort of using it seems like Rousseau is an aberration in a really long history of using those ideas in ways that we would now think of as anti-Semitic, or at least supersessionist, such that it's not that his philo-Semitism was turned into anti-Semitism, but rather that he just offered sort of a different interpretation than the usual to something like the New Israel and replacement with something better. So like inherently sort of the idea that a community or a religion replaces something before. And then I also had a question to Professor Rosenblatt, and just wondering about literary genre and how a novel like Corinne sort of fits into the persuasive rather than the coercive sort of dissolution of Judaism and this idea of a free marketplace, and sort of wondering sort of where the literary fits in to the sort of argumentative stance of the book itself.
No, no. I mean, I don't have any disagreement with what you just said. I didn't mean to say that Rousseau was typical of people who would be talking about a new Israel and who would be talking about Christian supersession in this way. It's simply that he took this in a different direction, and he took it in a direction which was much more concerned with the nature of nation states in a moment when people were beginning to really sort of debate what was a nation in a new way. So he was building on this, and certainly Rousseau was a Calvinist of Geneva himself, even if he was from a Calvinism that was developing in the way that Professor Rosenblatt said, he was still a product of that milieu in which Israel had a certain as a boy he would have certainly heard of Israel talked about in a certain way by the Genevan Calvinists, but he went off in his own different direction. I think it was built on it, and it was an incredibly influential direction as well.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. If I understood it correctly, you're asking about the novel and how it might have conveyed some political ideas. And I think that this is how that was the way she operated, Madame de Staël. I mean, you see it all over the place, all over her novels, ways of criticizing Napoleon, ways of criticizing what was going on in Paris and other places. And as you saw here, it was a way, sometimes I wonder, is she trying to convince Napoleon to do something, or is she trying to simply criticize him. She was, often when she was exiled for 10 years. It started with Delphine, her first novel that Napoleon was just furious about. She praised Protestantism. This is right when he's negotiated the Concordat with the Catholic Church. She goes full hog for Protestantism. She's speaks well of divorce when he's just radically reduced the possibilities of divorce with his civil code. And in Corinne, I could go on and on about how many political, jibes, do you call them that, or criticisms that are in her novel. So it was her way. And she would say, oh, no, me, I don't do politics when she was in trouble. No, I'll just write novels. Please let me come back to Paris because I'll be a good girl and I'll just write novels. But it was, no, she fooled no one with that. The other thing about novels is, and there's been a lot of scholarship on it, and they spoke about it then, is that it can convince people, that it can cause sentiments to emerge in the reader. And I think she did that a lot in her novels. These women who were so generous and they were so loving, and these are sentimental novels, so they're a little hard to read today. But these wonderful women full of emotions, I think it's supposed to be inspirational.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a question which may go a little bit beyond the specific presentations from which I learned a lot. But the Enlightenment is a phenomenon in Europe that goes. There is the British Enlightenment, there is the German Enlightenment, there is the French Enlightenment, which was somewhat represented more in weight in this panel. I want to ask the panelists if they would venture a generalization about the Jews and the Enlightenment, or if you would want to separate the German, the French, and the British, particularly. And I'm going to a phrase that Professor Lilti mentioned, pathologies of universalism. What do we do with that?
I'm next to a very distinguished historian here who wrote a book called The Religious Enlightenment. So I feel like I should defer to him on this. I would say that that to a certain extent, of course, one can generalize about the Enlightenment, because if there's any general principle which received more support from the people that we now call figures of the Enlightenment than any other, it was, of course, religious toleration. And so, because they certainly didn't agree on forms of government, and they certainly didn't agree on economics, and there were a lot of other things that the great thinkers of the Enlightenment were ready just to rip each other apart about, but they did, probably more than on anything else, agree that there should be religious toleration. And so that when you have regimes being born, which either because they are absolute regimes like the regimes of Joseph II in Austria, but feel a certain commitment to what was already being called at this point in Germany, die Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, or whether it's regimes like the French Revolution, which very directly saw themselves as being owing a great deal to the Enlightenment, they did tend to adopt principles of religious toleration. So that Joseph II in Austria, very much in line with and explicitly in line with principles that he called enlightened, issued an edict of toleration for the Jews. And then the French Revolution in 1790-91 emancipates the Jews. So to that extent, yes, but of course, the Enlightenment is a multifarious thing, as you said in your question. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot within it. There are a lot of different parts to it. You can't simply group everybody into one giant block called the Enlightenment, because as you heard from me and Professor Lilti, there's also a lot in there which could certainly be interpreted later as anti-Semitic. So yeah. I think, but to a certain extent, yes. Is there a fundamental relationship here between the Enlightenment and Jewish emancipation?
I just want to add a sort of conceptual distinction here, which is, I think in current discourse, we tend to confuse toleration with equality. And I think we have to keep in mind that they are two separate things. That for the Enlightenment, toleration did not mean the equality of religions. Toleration meant allowing inferior religions to subsist in a legislatively inferior position, which in the 18th century usually came under the term disabilities, right? The second thing I would say that's important is that toleration for the Enlightenment thinkers was never universal. It was always limited. Locke is the great avatar of toleration, refused to tolerate papists. Catholics were beyond the pale. Every Enlightenment thinker, however enlightened we want those thinkers to be, had his or her limits. There were those who were beyond the pale of toleration, beyond the pale of an legislatively inferior position, right? So I think, I think what's important to keep in mind is that there is a certain quantum leap between toleration based on ideas of natural right in the late 17th and 18th century and actual legal equality, right?
I mean, if I may say, to follow up on what you're saying is that you only tolerate something that you don't really like, right? That's baked into the word. But I also wonder, and I ask the panelists this also, if I find in France Protestants are overrepresented in the liberal movement and in liberal parties. And I don't know what to make of that. I remember reading also that Catholics at some point wanted their wives to be Protestant because they thought they were more virtuous. But I think there is a bit of a Protestant view or something to liberalism, something.
I'll just add, let's go back to the example of France, right? Protestants are extended toleration in 1787 by Louis XVI. And what that means is that they actually begin to have civic standing, that they can legally own property, and that their marriages are legally recognized, and therefore their progeny can inherit property, right? And then Louis XVI wanted to do the same for Jews, right? That is not equality. That is toleration in an inferior position in which you are extending legal recognition. In the case of Protestants, it was reversing the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, right? And so, anyway.
I'll be more straightforward. I think you cannot generalize. My answer is you can't generalize the question of Enlightenment and the Jews. And that's the problem with, for example, Polyakov or Herzberg. And that's a follow-up of my answer. Why you can't? Because even the question of toleration, I think you cannot generalize. Because what you said is right, but you have also some thinkers who have, in the 18th century, a new conception of toleration. And for example, Pierre Bayle, at the beginning of the 18th century, was no border, even atheist, even Muslim. Everyone has the right to have his own religion on an egalitarian position. And of course, if you have the Jews in mind, we have to quote the Lessing and Nathan the Wise, which is the great toleration manifesto of the German Enlightenment. So you have, and Lessing was a great reader and admirator of Voltaire, but Voltaire wrote some passages very critical of Jews, and listing.
I'm sorry, I didn't listen right the Education of the Human Rights,
Yeah.
Which has this kind of, what I'm saying,
exactly.
Judaism is here, Christianity is here,
Yes, but that's an history of human religion. But in Not Otherwise, you have an emulation, the ideal of emulation. And of course, as you know very well, he was a great friend of Mendelssohn and great admirer of Mendelssohn. So it's a very different conception of toleration than the one you have in Voltaire, for example. Voltaire's toleration, you know, there is this famous chapter about the London Stock Office, which is a paradigm of toleration, but a liberal toleration, but Erich Auerbach wrote a wonderful chapter about this text, saying that it was the conception of toleration and equality that was against the recognition of cultural differences. And that's what I had in mind when I spoke about the pathologies of universalism, is the fact that universalism at the core of the Enlightenment thought is about a common human nature, and it is the basis for liberalism, but also for equality. If any human person belong to the same human nature, so it is a base for equality. But at the same time, universalism can go with the refuse of recognition of cultural or religious differences. And then you can have intolerance in the name of tolerance. You can have the refusal of minorities in the name of the common humanities. And that is what I call the pathologies of universalism.
If I could just, I mean, my colleagues here are all sort of dialing back the Enlightenment here and emphasizing the limits, and they're absolutely right to do so. But at the same time, all these things open doors. And it opened doors that other people would walk through, and it created possibilities. So yes, all of these limits and to what the various aspects of the Enlightenment could do, absolutely. And yet it creates an enormous degree of hope, which people would take advantage of, and certainly in later periods.
If I could just to sort of say that, you know, these Enlightenment ideals come into Hungary largely as a kind of an affair of the Protestant nobility, the kind of lower gentry class, and they, I think, are very sincerely committed to them, and they not only are very much, you know, fighting things like blood libels in the 1880 and sort of really sort of supporting the kind of legal prosecution against them, but they passed laws by the 1890s that I think you can say legally, you know, are sort of full equality, not only individually, but also kind of as a recognition of Judaism as a religion on the same legal status as Protestantism or Catholicism. Of course, what things are in law and how things are in social practice are two different things, but.
Hi, thank you all. It's striking on the panel that I think Professor Sorkin spoke about a transnational story, and the rest of you even talk about European stories or national frames. So I'm curious about your thoughts about the people you're describing and how much they think of what they are engaged in or critiquing or responding to is something which is a global story. I don't mean Enlightenment, but I mean the liberal project. And I would focus it specifically for Professor Sorkin and say one of the powerful things you say is it's not just about German or French Jews, it's also American. What are the differences there? Or are you telling us really we should really abandon this idea of fundamental different character to American historical development with liberalism and with Jewish liberalism?
Thank you for that excellent question. Let me be inordinately blunt and impolitic. I think the notion, American Jewish history has been written for decades, time and again, using this notion of American Jewish exceptionalism, that the American Jewish experience differs fundamentally from the experience of Jews in Europe because in America, Jews did not have to be emancipated. They had equality from the time that from the promulgation of the Constitution, or at least Jewish males did. That is, a wonderful piece of fallacious propaganda. It has misled American Jews for probably a century and a half into thinking that they do not need to defend their status in American society the way European Jews did, that equal rights are a fait accompli, irreversible, and cast in stone. I would argue that American Jews did go through an emancipation process. They had to struggle for equal rights at the state level. In the early 19th century, the struggle in Maryland in the 1820s is one of the most obvious examples. In New Hampshire, Jews didn't gain the right to vote until 1874. I would argue that Jews undergo a second emancipation in the 20th century. The Civil Rights Movement from 1946 until 1968 is often, the Jewish version of that is that Jews engaged altruistically on behalf of African Americans in order to gain them civil rights. That's another piece of wonderfully egregious propaganda. Jews gained tremendously from the civil rights movement through equal opportunity employment, the Fair Housing Act, the end to quotas in educational institutions. Jews and other white ethnics, Italians and the Irish, were the true beneficiaries of the civil rights movement, much more so than African Americans. And I think today especially, it's important for Jews in the United States to realize that emancipation was a process in which they had to engage and to advocate and defend themselves, and that equal rights are in fact reversible, and that there is a history to draw upon in order to do that. I think the corollary to that in this notion of American Jewish exceptionalism is that anti-Semitism in the United States has always been social anti-Semitism. There's never been anti-Semitism from the state in the same way that was the case in Europe. That also is ludicrously false, right? Think about the immigration laws between 21 and 24, the national quota laws. Those are racist laws which told East European Jews who were already in the country that you are inferior and undesirable, right? And those laws were overturned by the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, which was the result of intense lobbying by Jewish and Italian organizations, right? Think about housing laws in the 1930s. The United States government issued brochures for banks and real estate agents listing in hierarchical order the preferred ethnic groups. Which groups were at the bottom? Jews and African Americans. That's when you begin to get covenanted neighborhoods. It's when cooperatives are invented in New York City in order to have legal ways of excluding Jews and other undesirables, right? And to this day, co-ops in New York have interviews which can exclude potential residents without giving any reason whatsoever, right? So all of that is then overturned, or much of it is overturned by the Fair Housing Act and other legislation during the civil rights movement, which the current administration would love to reverse.
Oh, I misunderstand. Do you have time? Sorry? Is there time? Oh, sure. So,
Please take the microphone behind you.
So perhaps another question. Thank you, Professor Sorkin, for the last statement, and thank you also for your earlier lecture. I'd like to ask a question about it, and then perhaps re-ask the question that Professor Samuels asked earlier of Professor Lilti. Perhaps I will, perhaps to continue the argument about continuity of emancipation from your book, I could see actually even in the lawyers and in Jewish politics in the 18th and in the 19th century, in the lawyers politics in the 18th century, a very, very similar politics to the one that you find in the 19th century. But you're absolutely right. The lawyers' politics in the Habsburg courts and in other courts in Europe in the 18th century was not about emancipation. It was something very new in the 19th century, just as you were describing. So I'm wondering then 1789, even if it's not on account of the legislation, at least on account of Jewish politics, must have been a breaking point. That is, then we can see a difference between 18th century and 19th century in terms of the history of emancipation. And if you agree then to that, then we have a unified panel very nicely in terms of the emergence of liberalism as a result of the French Revolution, which means also the emergence of pluralism, which then explains to us the openness of a further space as a result of liberalism for the Jews, and that is an advance over the notions of the Enlightenment, which could not accommodate the Jews, per Professor Lilti and Professor Bell, and explain to us also the split in Hungarian politics between those who can and cannot accommodate the Jews. But that all depends on you. That is on the recognition of emancipation as being very different after 1791 than it was before. Will you? The second question would be the second question would be to Professor Lilti. Professor Lilti, the argument is actually would be quite simple. Most of what Voltaire says against the Jews come from his biblical interpretation. It's a question about 18th century secular interpretation of the Bible, the way it emerges from the secular interpretation of the Bible of beginning with Spinoza. The move from Christian interpretation of the Bible, which sees, well, current Jews as completely blind and misled, but the people of the Bible as typologically predicting the people who are thought to be New Israel. But the people who emerge from Spinoza and from Voltaire are a nasty nation, right? So there's a description of a national character there, which the argument goes, this is indeed a stereotype of a nation, which has certain ethnic and racial character, which some people argue carries all the way through modernity, all the way to the 20th century. Now, not my argument. I have no dog in this fight. It may well be different, but this is what the argument is about. The argument as whether national character as it's emerging from biblical interpretation. Yes or no?
Well, there's two things. That's true that the biblical Hebrews are the main target of Voltaire, and the lot of what he wrote about the Jews was about the Hebrews and was linked with critique of the Bible and but it was not just this, because a lot of also of statements about modern Jews and the question of the specificity of their national character. But on this, the argument you made about the fact that the persistence of a national character of Jews explaining some form of anti-Semitic discourses was exactly what the historian, the British historian Trevor Roper replied to Herzberg in a very notorious paper in the New York Review of Books in 1968, and it was criticized in turn as being as having anti-Semitic aspects. He wrote a paper. The title was "Some of My Best Friends Are Philosophes." Of course, very ironic. So it's a very long way debate, but the point I wanted to stress, and maybe I was not clear enough sooner when I answer to Maury, is the fact that in you can make many arguments about Voltaire's text, and you have to be very precise because some of the text people are quoting are the text that Labroux has modified in his anthology. So you have to be very cautious when you go back to Voltaire's text. But the main thing is that with Polyakov or Herzberg, the critique is not about Voltaire. It's a critique about progress. And that's the question. It's not a critique about Voltaire and his anti-Semitism. That's a pretext. That's a critique of progress, of the ideology of progress. And my argument at the end is that it's at the root of the new form of using the denunciation of anti-Semitism against the left and progressive discourse. And that's the point, in fact, I wanted to make.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Malachi, about the nature of emancipation. I think about 1790-91 or the ideas of 1789. I don't want to be too iconoclastic here, but I think it's important to realize that the French Revolution and the emancipation of the Jews becomes the great image of emancipation, but it does not actually, it does not become the dominant program or agenda of emancipation. There are two different versions of emancipation that emerge in the 1780s and 1790s. The first is that of conditional incremental emancipation introduced by Joseph II with his edicts of toleration, right? And remember, there wasn't just one edict of toleration. The Habsburg Empire was an agglomeration of territories. You could never legislate for all of them. Joseph II had to negotiate legislation for each of the different territories, right? But it's that model of incremental emancipation, conditional incremental emancipation, which actually becomes the dominant model in Europe. The notion of giving unconditional emancipation on the spot, which is the image of the French Revolution, is actually also wrong, because the first decree of emancipation for the Sephardic Jews was not a revolutionary decree. It recognized the existing privileges of the Jews of Bordeaux and Bayonne, and then on that basis of recognizing their existing privileges, extended the right of active citizenship, the franchise. That was not a revolutionary edict. The Edict of 1791 for the Ashkenazic Jews was a revolutionary edict because it abrogated the existing corporate institutions, right? What Clermont-Tonnerre said, our judges must be their judges, And on that basis, then incorporated Jews into the polity on the basis of equality. But if you look across Europe, it's the conditional incremental model that is usually used.
But Napoleon brings it, right?
I'm sorry?
Napoleon.
Well, but that's only, by conquest that Napoleon introduces that model. When Napoleon falls, those laws fall. The Congress of Vienna does not restore the Napoleonic legal situation. Look at Russia. In the Great Reforms, Alexander II introduces an incremental model. Those are reversed by Alexander III and Nicholas II. The French model only prevails at times of war and revolution. It is not the model that is introduced during, in peacetime. Even the Prussian emancipation of 1812 is a result. It's part of the Great Reforms, which result from Prussia's defeat in war, right? And you can go, state by state across Europe and see the same development.
If I may, I think, though, there are two different perspectives we can use to answer your question about 1789. I mean, one is to look at it from the point of view of the Jewish strategies, and there, I think Professor Sorkin is absolutely correct. But 1789 does, of course, something else as well, because it has a certain role in bringing about modern liberal politics, and everything that Professor Sorkin was talking about in his talk, the press using, the lawyers, the communal associations, all these things which involve, basically the competition within a free market of politics. That is liberal politics, and to the extent that the French Revolution contributes to the creation of that, obviously 1789, 90, 91 mark a very important shift, because it allows for the Jewish organizations that Professor Sorkin is about to do this, rather than simply trying to plead for the favor of a prince.